January 17, 1945, somewhere near the frozen outskirts of a German village. Inside a steel giant, the air is thick with gunpowder and oil. The tank rocks violently as artillery shells explode nearby, each blast shaking dust from the turret walls. The radio crackles with urgency. Then comes the order. Sharp, absolute. Open fire now. Through the gun sight, a young gunner locks eyes on movement in the distance. Dark figures crossing a snowy field. His heartbeat drowns out the chaos. They could be German infantry or Allied scouts who lost their way. The commander's voice roars again, louder this time, desperate. Fire, damn it! That's an order! But the boy's finger freezes on the trigger. 1 second, 2. The moment stretches like eternity. He doesn't fire. Outside, the figures raise their hands. Not weapons, but white cloths waving against the wind. Civilians. Refugees. That single act of hesitation. Defiance. Some would say, would not only save lives that day, it would force an entire command to question what obedience truly means in war. The world was burning, yet one gunner refused to pull the trigger. By the winter of 1945, the war in Europe had reached its final brutal chapter. The Allied advance pressed deep into the heart of Nazi Germany. Entire towns were reduced to rubble. Forests became graveyards of tanks and twisted steel. For those fighting on the front lines, every village and hedgerow could hide death. Tank warfare dominated the battlefield. The machines themselves, M4 Shermans, Panthers, and Tigers, were more than weapons. They were moving fortresses of fear and survival. Inside them, crews of 4 or 5 young men lived shoulder to shoulder in metal coffins, their world reduced to periscopes, dials, and deafening thunder. Orders came fast, often faster than thought. A gunner had only seconds to decide whether a shadow through the gun sight meant life or death. Misjudgment could mean annihilation, or the slaughter of one's own. Commanders drilled obedience into every fiber of their men. Hesitation was seen as weakness, disobedience as betrayal. But as the Allies approached the German border, the chaos of war blurred every rule. German soldiers fled in civilian clothes. Refugees streamed through the countryside in all directions, families desperate to escape the bombing. Even trained reconnaissance units struggled to tell friend from foe. In this confusion, one mistake could trigger disaster. Convoys ambushed their own. Infantry units fired on Allies in the fog. And for tank crews, the most isolated and pressured soldiers. On the field, the line between duty and conscience narrowed to a heartbeat. 3 tank that would define this story belonged to the U.S. 3rd Armored Division, one of the spearhead units driving toward the Rhine. Their orders were clear: advance, secure, and eliminate all enemy resistance. The men were exhausted, cold, and haunted by the ghosts of villages already burned behind them. Among them was a 19-year-old gunner, barely out of training. He had survived the Ardennes by inches, watched friends burn alive in shattered tanks, and learned the hard truth of war. You either follow orders or you die. But on that January morning, as snow drifted across the fields and smoke curled from the ruins ahead, something changed. The enemy was retreating. The front lines had dissolved into confusion. Columns of civilians, farmers, women, children, wandered aimlessly between military positions. Allied soldiers were warned of infiltration, told to shoot first if unsure. That's when the young gunner spotted figures through his scope. Blurred shapes moving near the tree line. The commander barked the usual command, "Target! Fire!" But something didn't feel right. Their movement was slow, hesitant. The way they waved wasn't military. He hesitated just long enough to hear a faint shout through the cold air, a sound that didn't belong to war. And in that hesitation, began a story that would challenge everything he'd been taught about duty and obedience. To understand what that hesitation meant, we must first understand the world that shaped it. By early 1945, Allied command had turned warfare into an unrelenting machine of momentum. Orders were simple: keep pushing east. Every delay risked giving the Germans time to regroup. Every hesitation could cost lives, your own or your comrades'. For tank crews, this doctrine was absolute. Their commanders had been drilled under General Omar Bradley's steady but firm leadership. Advance, identify, destroy. The U.S. 3rd Armored Division, nicknamed Spearhead, had earned its reputation in Normandy and the Battle of the Bulge. It moved fast, struck hard, and obeyed orders without question. The men inside its tanks lived by a single rule: when the commander says fire, you fire. A tank gunner was the most pressured man in the entire crew. His job was both technical and emotional. He held the trigger that could decide dozens of fates. He sat in the dark belly of the machine, peering through his sight, ready to unleash 75 millimeters of destruction at a single command. He didn't see faces. He saw movement, silhouettes, targets. But in January 1945, the front was no longer a clean line of enemies and allies. German resistance had fractured into desperate pockets. Surrendering soldiers mingled with terrified civilians. Entire towns fled the approach of Allied armor, waving white sheets in the snow. Rumors spread through the ranks. German snipers were hiding among refugees, SS troops disguised as medics or priests. Fear became the lens through which every soldier viewed the world. That fear hardened commanders. They reminded their crews that hesitation kills, that mercy could be a trap, that the safest course was obedience. Shoot first, verify later. The official doctrine, though never written in those words, was clear enough. And so, on the outskirts of a nameless German village, a 19-year-old American gunner found himself inside that doctrine, holding his breath behind a scope. The world outside was white with frost and smoke. His tank, one of 5 in the column, crawled toward a cluster of trees at the edge of the village. Through his sight, he saw movement. He called it out. The commander looked, swore, and shouted, "Enemy infantry! Range 400! Open fire!" Inside that tank, discipline met doubt. The gunner's finger rested on the trigger guard. But what he saw didn't fit. There was no muzzle flash, no organized retreat, no weapons visible. Only shivering shapes moving clumsily across open ground. "Open fire now!" The commander barked again, but this time the gunner didn't obey. That moment, that pause, would ripple far beyond one frozen field. It would spark debates among officers, investigations into engagement protocols, and eventually, a quiet recognition that sometimes refusal could be as brave as obedience. Because in that single second, when war demanded blind action, one soldier's doubt would remind the world of something war too often forgets: the cost of being human behind the trigger. The human angle inside every war machine, beneath every helmet. There is a mind trying to survive chaos. For most tank gunners in World War II, that meant learning to silence fear and conscience. Orders were orders. You followed them or people died. Yet in that frozen German field, the young gunner's hesitation revealed a truth commanders rarely acknowledged: that no soldier, no matter how disciplined, could ever completely silence the human instinct to question. He had spent months watching death through a narrow sight, men torn apart by shells, houses vaporized by a single shot. He knew the power his finger held. To fire meant safety for his crew, perhaps, but death for whoever was on the other end. Each pull of the trigger carved a weight that never left him. By 1945, the psychological toll on tank crews had become unbearable. Military psychiatrists called it combat fatigue. Soldiers called it the shakes. Some froze under fire. Others fired too soon. But this young man's pause was not fear. It was recognition. He had seen civilians caught in crossfire before. Farmers waving in panic, children running between tanks. He had seen the aftermath of mistaken shelling, dead villagers buried under collapsed stone. In those moments, enemy and innocent blurred beyond recognition. When he saw the figures near the tree line that day, his training screamed one thing, but his humanity whispered another. His gut told him something was wrong. Their movements too clumsy for soldiers, their shapes too uneven for armed men. He hesitated. That hesitation, that flicker of doubt, was the essence of humanity surviving inside the machinery of war. Psychologists who studied soldiers after the war found that moments like these were common but rarely spoken of. Many gunners admitted they sometimes delayed a shot by seconds, hoping the target would reveal itself more clearly. Others confessed to firing deliberately wide, unable to stomach the uncertainty. War demanded reflex, but the heart demanded reason. The young gunner's choice defied the chain of command, yet it reflected something deeper: moral intuition. In an era where obedience was glorified and dissent was punished, moral hesitation was an act of silent courage. It wasn't about disloyalty, it was about clarity, seeing through the fog of orders and fear long enough to realize that pulling the trigger wasn't always the right thing. For many veterans, such moments would haunt them far more than the battles they survived. Because in that instant of choice, between obedience and humanity, they confronted the very question war tried to erase. What if following orders means losing yourself? And for this 19-year-old gunner, the answer came in the shape of a white cloth waving in the cold wind. He didn't know it then, but his hesitation had just rewritten the fate of an entire field, and would soon force even his superiors to confront what courage really meant. The tactical and leadership. Angled from a purely military perspective, what the young gunner did should have been impossible. A tank crew was built on obedience, a precision instrument of destruction that functioned only when every man followed his role without hesitation. The commander observed and ordered, the gunner aimed and fired, the loader reloaded, and the driver maneuvered. One delay could mean death. One refusal could doom an entire platoon. Yet, in that brief second of defiance, something far larger than disobedience occurred. It was a rare collision between the tactical doctrine of command and the moral intelligence of the individual soldier, the kind of moment that military history often hides behind statistics. Throughout the war, Allied and Axis forces both suffered from catastrophic friendly fire incidents caused by rushed target identification. Tanks destroyed friendly positions. Aircraft strafed their own convoys. In the confusion of smoke, snow, and shattered communications, mistakes multiplied. The U.S. Army's after-action reports from 1944 and 1945 showed dozens of such errors, each ending in tragedy. Commanders knew it, but in the chaos of battle, the solution was always the same: simplify, obey, survive. That doctrine worked, until it didn't. When visibility was low and communication thin, overconfidence became lethal. Blind obedience often led to chaos masquerading as order. The young gunner's act, his refusal to shoot until he was sure, stood in direct opposition to the system designed to keep him alive. And yet, it was precisely that disobedience that preserved his unit. Because seconds later, when the tank commander climbed out to confirm the target himself, the truth emerged. Civilians, a small group of refugees who had wandered into the combat zone, waving tattered rags in surrender. Had the gunner fired, the shell would have detonated among them, an irreversible atrocity that would have followed the unit forever. This was not just an emotional revelation. It was a tactical one. In modern military analysis, this kind of decision is called situational restraint, the ability to assess before engaging. It's now taught as part of ethical combat leadership, but in 1945 it was nearly unheard of. Commanders of the time faced an impossible balance: enforce discipline or allow judgment. Too much control and you risked dehumanizing the soldier. Too much autonomy and you risked chaos. Yet, in this instance, a young private had proven something profound. That intuition, when rooted in discipline and awareness, could be as vital as any written order. After the incident, reports circulated within the division. The tank commander initially wrote the gunner up for failure to engage, but the company captain, upon reviewing the situation, dismissed the charge. Instead, he issued a quiet commendation for restraint under confusion. No medals, no ceremony, just an acknowledgement that sometimes the hardest act of courage in war is to wait. In hindsight, that moment hinted at the future of modern warfare, a slow evolution from blind obedience toward informed decision-making. The lesson was buried in reports and memoirs, but its echo remained clear. Even in the most disciplined armies, survival depends not just on obedience, but on judgment. The air outside was still and brittle with cold. Snow clung to the edges of burned-out vehicles as the armored column crept forward, its engines growling low beneath the weight of exhaustion. The young gunner's eyes stayed fixed on the periscope. The crosshairs aligned perfectly on the movement near the trees. "Target in range," he murmured. Then, "Fire!" The commander barked, his voice echoing off the metal walls. But the gunner didn't move. His breath fogged the glass. The figures were close now, too close. The loader's hand hovered, waiting. The commander leaned forward, fury rising in his tone. "What are you doing? Fire!" Inside that confined space, time fractured. The rhythmic clatter of treads, the rattle of machine guns somewhere ahead. Everything seemed to fade. The young gunner's finger rested on the trigger, trembling slightly. His training screamed for obedience, but his instincts refused to yield. Through the magnified lens, he caught it. A glint of cloth, pale against the snow. It wasn't a rifle barrel. It was fabric, torn and fluttering weakly in the wind. A white rag. He froze. The commander, unable to wait any longer, shoved past him, pressing his eye to the scope. What he saw pulled the breath from his chest. Civilians, 6 of them. A woman, an old man, and children. Their faces pale and hollow, stumbling through the frost, with their hands raised high. The silence that followed was deafening. No words, just realization. If that trigger had been pulled, one shell would have ended it all. No witnesses, no time for questions. Just another confirmed kill written in the fog of war. The commander lowered his head slowly. For a moment, even he couldn't speak. Then, quietly, he exhaled, a sound half relief, half shame. He looked at the gunner. "Stand down," he said at last. "Hold your fire." Outside, the refugees collapsed in the snow, exhausted but alive. The other tanks, still waiting for the first shot, halted in confusion. Then, over the radio, the commander's voice broke the silence. "Hold fire. Not enemy, civilians." The words rippled through the headsets like a lifeline. 1 second of hesitation had just spared 6 lives, and changed the meaning of obedience forever. For several seconds, no one inside the tank spoke. The engine idled softly, the smell of diesel and cordite lingering in the frozen air. The young gunner kept his hands on the grips, staring through the sight at the distant shapes. 6 civilians, shivering, terrified, but breathing. The commander exhaled slowly, his breath visible in the chill. What had nearly been an act of destruction now became a moment of revelation. He climbed halfway out of the turret, scanning the horizon through his binoculars. The other tanks in the platoon waited, guns trained but unmoving. Over the radio, confused voices crackled. "Why haven't we engaged? What's the holdup? The commander keyed the mic. Negative fire. Non-combatants ahead. Confirmed civilians. The line went silent. Then one by one, the other tanks powered down their main guns. The thunder of war subsided into the faint whisper of falling snow. When the order finally came to advance, the company halted short of the tree line. Medics emerged cautiously from the trailing half-track, approaching the figures who had dropped to their knees. The woman clutched a small child in her arms, her face hollow, her voice too faint to carry. She had been walking for days, fleeing the eastern bombardment, moving west toward safety she barely believed in. The gunner watched through the narrow slit as his crewmates climbed out to help. He saw the refugees led toward the rear of the convoy, offered blankets, food, water, small fragments of mercy amid ruin. He realized then what his inaction had meant. His refusal had not been weakness. It had been clarity. When the commander climbed back into the turret, his expression was distant, not angry, but shaken. He glanced once at the gunner. "You trusted your eyes," he said quietly. "That saved us all. Because had they fired, it would not have been just the civilians who died. The blast might have revealed their position to hidden German anti-tank guns further ahead. An ambush waiting to spring. The entire platoon could have been lost in the counterfire. What had begun as disobedience had, by fate and instinct, turned into salvation. In the haze of war, one act of restraint had preserved not only 6 civilian lives, but an entire armored unit. And from that moment on, every man in that tank crew would look through their sights differently. When the smoke cleared and the column finally moved on, the incident was quietly logged in the battalion's after-action report. A single line buried among dozens of routine entries. Engagement withheld. Civilian presence confirmed. No shots fired. To headquarters, it was a footnote. Nothing more. But inside the tank, the air was different now. The silence between the crew spoke louder than the guns that never fired. The young gunner sat in the turret, staring at the empty shell he never loaded, his gloves trembling faintly. He wasn't thinking of medals or punishment. He was thinking of the faces. The woman clutching her child. The man too weak to stand. The faint gratitude in their eyes as soldiers handed them rations. That night, when the unit made camp, the commander sat alone by the half-track's dim light, filling out his daily report. His pen hesitated over the line marked "Enemy Casualties." None. He stared at the page for a long time, then quietly closed the logbook. Word of the event spread informally across the company. Some mocked the gunner, calling him the boy who froze. Others defended him, saying his hesitation had likely saved the entire platoon from an ambush. Even among seasoned veterans, opinions divided. But among the officers who reviewed the report days later, one detail stood out. Confirmed civilians. In an army that prized efficiency and obedience, this was unusual. Not a reprimand, not a commendation. Simply a recognition that something inhuman had been avoided. The captain overseeing the unit later told his men during a briefing, almost in passing, "Sometimes, the best trigger is the one that stays cold." That sentence lingered long after the war ended. In the months that followed, as the Allies swept through Germany and the fighting slowed, the young gunner remained with his crew. They passed through more ruined towns, faced more close calls, but the moment in the snow became their quiet reference point. A private truth shared among men who had seen how thin the line between duty and conscience could be. He had been trained to destroy, but on that frozen morning, by doing nothing, he had preserved what war tries hardest to erase: humanity itself. Weeks later, as the 3rd Armored Division pushed deeper into the heart of Germany, the incident was nearly forgotten amid the larger tide of victory. Town after town fell. Bridges were captured, resistance crumbled, and news of Allied triumphs filled the radio waves. But among those who had been there that day, the memory remained vivid, a silent reminder of how close they had come to tragedy. The Gunners Act never appeared in official commendations. No general ever mentioned it in speeches. Yet, among his crewmates, it became a kind of whispered legend. When new recruits joined the company, veterans would tell the story in low tones beside campfires. Kids saw civilians through the scope. Didn't fire. Saved 6 lives. Maybe more. It wasn't a tale of heroism in the traditional sense. No medals, no charges, no clear enemy defeated. But in the brutal arithmetic of war, restraint had always been the least celebrated form of courage. The kind that leaves no monument, only memory. In later years, declassified records and veteran testimonies would show just how common and devastating mistaken engagements had been in those final months. Allied tank crews often operated ahead of communication lines, identifying targets by silhouette alone. In those conditions, the difference between enemy and civilian could vanish in a blink. Historians studying the campaign later used this incident, among others, to illustrate what they called the moral strain of mechanized warfare. Machines extended human reach, but they also dulled human judgment. The young gunners' refusal, they argued, was not weakness. It was awareness, a conscious reclaiming of judgment from the machine. After the war, he returned home quietly. He never spoke much about what happened in that field except once, to a fellow veteran years later, during a reunion. When asked why he didn't fire, he simply said, "Because I wasn't sure. And if you're not sure, you don't pull the trigger." Those words, humble and unadorned, captured the weight of an entire generation's conscience. In a war built on certainty, on orders and absolutes, he had chosen doubt, and that doubt had saved lives. His act never made the history books, but in the quiet pages of unrecorded history, it stood as proof that even in total war, there are moments when choosing not to act becomes the most powerful act of all. War remembers its explosions, not its silences. The names carved in stone are often those who charged forward, who pulled the trigger, who obeyed. But history rarely pauses for the ones who didn't, the ones who saw through the smoke, heard the chaos, and still found enough of themselves left to stop. That young gunner's hesitation didn't win a battle, seize a bridge, or change the war's outcome. Yet, in the moral landscape of human conflict, it mattered profoundly, because in a world trained to obey, he listened to something quieter, the fragile instinct to question. Every soldier is taught that hesitation kills. But what happens when obedience does? In that frozen field, surrounded by orders, doctrine, and fear, one 19-year-old refused to become a machine. He remembered, for just a heartbeat, that behind every moving shape in his scope might be a life, one that didn't belong to war. Modern militaries would later codify this instinct into doctrine. Positive target identification, rules of engagement, ethical restraint. Yet, long before those phrases existed, it was carried by soldiers like him, unrecorded, uncelebrated, but quietly shaping the future of how wars would be fought. Because courage isn't always the sound of gunfire. Sometimes it's the silence that follows, the decision to hold one's fire when everything around demands you don't, the decision to see, not just aim. History is written by victories, but humanity is preserved by those who hesitate just long enough to remember what's right. Somewhere, in a forgotten snowy field of 1945, a tank once stood silent when it could have spoken in thunder. And in that silence, that single second of refusal, a young man reminded the world that even in its darkest hour, conscience can still outweigh command.